All right, Chapter 24, Section 3, Global Politics and Economics. What role did the U.S. take on in the global politics and economics following the Cold War? So by the end of the chapter, how the U.S. responded to changes in the global economy, some of the foreign policy goals and actions of the Clinton administration, and then U.S. relations with various Middle Eastern countries and groups, and some of this stuff has relevance to world events today. So when we look at competing in a global economy, the role of free trade. So free trade is essentially that countries aren't going to place tariffs and restrictions on incoming and outgoing goods and services. That literally trade can happen unhindered, unrestricted around the world. So if we look at the positives of free trade, the result is a lowering costs of goods and services. A negative is loss of jobs to overseas, because what companies will do is they'll relocate to places where they don't have to pay as high a wages in some instances. Now, if you look at the way political parties stand on this pre-1990s, the reason I say pre-1990s is because when we look at Democrats, traditionally they opposed free trade because they were supporting American workers. They had a lot of support in labor unions, and so they didn't want to do anything that would cause jobs to be lost overseas. Now with President Clinton, that changes. He is a pro-free trade Democrat. And what we've seen in the last presidential election is that for the first time we see Republicans being anti-free trade, which is not their traditional long-standing stance on free trade. And one of the other criticisms of free trade is that essentially what it does is it makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. When you look at poor nations, these rich nations have all kinds of advantages. They can get around loopholes, and I'll talk about that maybe in a little bit here. So when we look at competing in the global economy, and the way Clinton views it is he supports free trade, and we're going to see that a little bit later on. I think the next slide has something like 270 free trade agreements were signed by President Clinton. But one of the things that's really going to kind of move us in the direction of free trade is in 1993, the countries of Europe form the EU, the European Union. They adopt a single currency, the euro, and what we start to see is that there is more economic efficiency. By creating this European Union, goods and services flow across Europe more freely, more efficiently, more effectively, and what that allows them to do is to produce goods at a lower cost. And then it makes it really difficult when you look at the United States, for example. We aren't able to compete with that, and it's challenging our U.S. dominance. Now, when we fast forward to present, if you've heard about Brexit, what Brexit is that Great Britain has voted to leave the European Union. They're gonna go back to having the British pound as their currency. And it'll be interesting to see how that whole thing shakes out and the impact that it has on the rest of the European Union. In response, the United States meets with Mexico and Canada, and they create the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing that they did in Europe. We're going to allow goods and services to flow across borders without taxes and tariffs. And President Bush signs it. The problem is Congress is mostly Democrats, and so they block this. And what they want to see is they don't want to see this immediate removal of trade restrictions because they think it's going to hurt the American worker. What they want is gradual, systematic changes so that it gives the American companies time to adjust and adapt to these new rules, and hopefully that will impact American workers less. If you look at NAFTA and the pros and the cons, or the supporters and the critics, again, what the supporters believe is that it's going to promote economic growth across North America. It's going to reduce prices, which it did. It's going to increase American exports, which it did. It's going to lead to more investment from overseas investors, which it did. For anti-NAFTA, they believe that manufacturers are going to relocate, which happened initially. They're going to have lower wages for American workers, and that there's going to be less regulation. So if a company moves to Mexico and they're polluting the environment, there's nothing the United States can do to keep that company from polluting the environment. And that is going to lead to an overall loss of jobs. Now, when you look at kind of the downfall of NAFTA, there were loss of jobs. Now, the thing that's really difficult to know is we had already seen that trend in manufacturing starting way back in the 1950s, that America was losing manufacturing jobs and gaining service sector jobs. So how much of it is NAFTA and how much of it was already trends in place, I can't tell you. Now, the other thing that we have seen is with the manufacturing relocating, so if we look at the automobile industry, I mean, that's a perfect example. What we've seen is because of NAFTA, cars are built Mexico, United States, and Canada. That what's happened is cars have actually become more efficient because parts can be built, or part of cars can be built and manufactured in one country and then shipped to another country and then finished in a third country. And it's really kind of benefited all three, and it's benefited the car manufacturers as a whole. So competing in this global economy, U.S. joining NAFTA, again, Clinton is going to come into office. He is a Democrat. Congress is democratically controlled. And so he's able to push this through Congress, and in 1994 it went into effect. In 2008, the final provisions of NAFTA kicked in, and what we've seen is this has been a net good for the United States. It's actually increased the number of jobs. It's increased our trading relationship with Canada and Mexico. They are our biggest trading partners, and so it has had a very positive impact, not just on the American economy, but also on the Canadian and Mexican economy as well. And so it's really been a very positive thing for all three countries, and actually, if you look across the world as well. And I mentioned this before. The other thing we see is GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. That was dating back to post-World War II. If you remember, we talked about that, whatever chapter that would have been, 14, 15, 16, something like that. The idea is that it's going to reduce tariffs and it's going to increase trade around the world. What we see is GATT is going to go away and it's going to be replaced by the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is there to negotiate trade. It's there to settle any kind of disputes and enforce compliance to the World Trade Organization rules. Now, here's an example of how big countries can find loopholes. So, according to the World Trade Organization, countries cannot pay subsidies to their farmers to make a product more profitable. And what has happened in farm bills, at least up until 2014, farm bills in the United States have provided $3.29 billion in subsidies to American cotton farmers. The reason being is that American cotton farmers aren't able to compete with cotton grown around the world, specifically in Brazil, in Africa, and in China. So that violated the World Trade Organization rules. Brazil took the United States to court at the World Trade Organization, and the World Trade Organization found in favor of Brazil. Well, the United States didn't want to stop paying farm subsidies. So what we started to do is we started to pay Brazil $30 million a year to their cotton farmers to help subsidize their cotton industry as well. And up until 2014, that's what was happening. Now, since then, the Farm Bill has pulled cotton out of the farm subsidies. At least that's my understanding of what I just recently read. but we still pay something like $127 million to Brazil in hopes of them not continuing to pursue this lawsuit, which we've already lost once, we'd probably lose twice. When we look at the critics of the World Trade Organization and the World Bank, which the United States has like 16 or 20% of the votes in, both of those organizations, according to critics, favor money over protecting the environment and workers. And so that is something that has been widely protested. And so what this picture is, in 1999, Seattle, Washington, there was a big, huge protest at the World Trade Organization meeting about the different things that they're doing and how they're not protecting the environment and not protecting workers. So this has been a pretty controversial organization. For the vast majority of people, they see this as being a good thing. New ideas, technology, communication, the fact that through this World Trade Organization we're able to support and spread democracy, at least up until fairly recently. It normalizes trade, it strengthens ties to other countries, and overall it's been a fairly net positive. And one of the other things that I read is, for example, your cell phone. Without free trade, without, if we started to put more restrictions on things, if we started to launch these trade wars, we can expect things like cell phones, computers, their price will increase 3 to 4 times. So whatever you paid for your cell phone, if we get rid of these free trade agreements, you can kind of figure that 3 and 4 is probably a little on the high end, but it's not unrealistic for consumer products to maybe double in price, especially things with technology related. So when we look at foreign diplomacy, there's a couple of key areas of concern from the Bush administration going into the Clinton administration. Somalia is in the midst of a civil war and a severe famine. In 1992, President Bush assembles a multinational force, and Clinton is going to continue this multinational force to try and protect the people of Somalia and to help provide food and services to deal with this famine. By 1994, our troops and these multinational troops are suffering pretty high casualty rates. And so as a result, we decide to remove our troops. And what ends up happening is Somalia just totally falls apart, and there's utter devastation as there's no one there any longer to kind of protect the people from what's going on there. The other place is Haiti. Haiti is going to hold a free election. Aristide is going to get elected. The military did not like the fact that Aristide was elected, and so they have a military coup. The result is all of those people who supported Aristide and voted for Aristide become political refugees. They fear for their lives. So they flee Haiti. They go to the United States. The U.S. then just sends them back to Haiti. And in order to protect those people that we just sent back, we send troops and we restore Aristide to power, and that kind of temporarily fixes things in Haiti. They were better after that, but not great. Now, one of the problems when we look at American foreign policy in post-Cold War is we kind of pick and choose which places we go into. And a lot of the times when you look at why we choose to go into some places and why we choose not to go into other places, some of these places we go into, like for example Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, these are hotbeds for terrorism. And so by going in there and trying to restore and maintain order, we're hoping to probably pull some of the oxygen out of these terrorist organizations that set up shop in these places. When we look at a place like Haiti, because it's so close to us, if there's instability and people flee and leave, the most likely place they're going to try and come to for protection and for safety and for a better life is the United States. And so there's some places that maybe we ignore just because we don't see how it impacts us directly. And so it's really difficult for nations to know which places we're going to help and which ones we're not. And that's one criticism of the post-Cold War foreign policy is there's not a really set way to make these decisions. The other place that we're going to get involved in is Eastern Europe. As long as communism was around, communism kept kind of these old rivalries and stuff in check. When we look at Yugoslavia, there's 6 different regions within Yugoslavia that formed the country of Yugoslavia. 4 of those are going to create new states. If we look at Bosnia, Bosnia is this mix of Orthodox Serbs, Roman Catholic Croats, and then Muslim Bosnians. And the Serbians are by far the biggest, most dominant group. Plus, they have a Serbian majority in other parts of Yugoslavia. And so they're probably the biggest of all of these groups. And what you start seeing is Serbians start to remove and murder Bosnians and Croats within their country. And so when you look at 1991 to 1998, the red represents the Serbians, the blue, I believe, is the Croats, and then the green is the Bosnians. And what you see is the country itself is going to sanction the mass murder, the rape, and violence against these other 2 ethnic groups. And essentially what the Serbians are going to try and do is they're going to try and ethnically cleanse Serbia of these other 2 groups. They're going to try and wipe them out. So a genocide, essentially. So NATO forces are going to go into this part of the world. They're going to bomb Serbian strongholds, and eventually, through this multinational NATO force, it's the first time that NATO has used its forces militarily. So even after the Cold War, NATO, for the first time, which was designed to deal with the Cold War, post-Cold War is the first time we're actually going to really use forces. They're going to force a ceasefire. What you see is that's going to kind of temporarily cool things down. However, in 1998, Serbia goes back into Kosovo and causing troubles again. NATO reassembles its forces and it kicks Serbia out. And since then, things have been kind of simmering below the surface, but it's been relatively peaceful. When we look at the totals of this thing, somewhere around 200,000 people were dead, most of them buried in mass graves, somewhere between 50 and 100,000 rapes, 2.2 million people were forced out of their homes. And to show how recently this stuff has still been in the news, in November of 2017, one of the guys who was in charge of this killing and raping was found guilty of war crimes and was sentenced to 40 years in prison, which he's fairly old, so he's essentially got a life sentence for that. When we look at the Middle East, the thing about the Middle East is this. Post-World War II is the first time that we see Israel showing up as a country. So before that, it was Palestine. What happened after World War II, because of the Holocaust, the world decided, the United Nations and the world decided, that Jewish people needed a homeland of their own. So they created a new country called Israel. And then what happened is, bit by bit, little by little, these Palestinians were forced out of their homes. What Palestinians have called for since then is essentially what they call a 2-state solution. They want to be able to have a Palestine within Israel. And so they want some self-rule. 2 of the areas where they really are arguing over are Jericho and the Gaza Strip. And so if you look at Gaza, there's the Gaza Strip. That's a place that they want. The West Bank is another place, and the Golan Heights is where you have large numbers of Palestinians, and what they would like to see is those places become Palestine, and then Israel can be Israel, Palestine can be Palestine, and that's essentially kind of the idea here. And one of the things that the negotiations wanted, besides Palestinian self-rule, is security and safety for the Israelis against bombings and all those types of things. The real problem is the settlement that is reached in 1993 with President Clinton and the leaders of the Palestinians and the leader of Israel is it never really dealt with these West Bank settlements. The Jewish people of Israel had been going into the West Bank and building homes and settlements even though they weren't supposed to. The other problem is you have extremists on both sides that nothing was really done to placate or make either of those two extremist groups happy. And so this settlement's going to be kind of shaky from the beginning. In 2000, they're close to a second agreement. However, Israel then votes in a new prime minister who's very hawkish. He doesn't want to give in to the Palestinians. He's going to push for more settlements in the West Bank, and then talks totally fell apart, and the violence between these two groups increased. To fast forward to today, the most recent event that has reignited some of these bad feelings between these two groups is the United States' decision to build their U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is a place of contention. If you remember from world history, there are three different groups that have holy sites in Jerusalem. You've got the Eastern Orthodox Church, you have Christianity, and then you also have Islam. And so all three of those consider Jerusalem to be one of the holiest places on earth. And so Jerusalem is a place that's going to always generate a lot of controversy. And so by moving our embassy to Jerusalem and officially recognizing Jerusalem as Israeli and Jewish has caused an awful lot of problems and uproar in the Islamic world. So for dealing with terrorism, the first time we really see Al-Qaeda dealing a blow to the United States is in 1993. They bombed the World Trade Center for the first time. They drive a car loaded with explosive into the basement, hoping to bring the building down. And what we find is that this organization is led by Osama bin Laden, the same guy that we gave money and supplies to in Afghanistan. And his goal is to not only end U.S. involvement in Muslim countries, but to end all Western involvement in countries. And that's why he's attacking the United States and the World Trade Center, because he sees that as an outgrowth of Western influence. The next thing we see is in 1998, Al-Qaeda attacks U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And in 2000, we see the USS Cole, that's off the coast of Yemen, being bombed by a ship. A ship pulled up alongside it and exploded, and it killed 17 American sailors. So we're starting to see this terrorism growing and expanding and becoming more aggressive. And that's when eventually will lead up to 9/11.